Hey Julian, thanks for agreeing to be interviewed as part of the Leicester Festival. This would have been our 16th year of running a kind of 1 or 2 week festival celebrating cycling and people-friendly streets in the city. Obviously, COVID had an impact on our planning for this year. Jan's project has put a lot of resources into bike aids, providing bikes for essential key workers, bike fixes, bike maintenance, and the likes. But we got closer to the planned dates for this festival, and we decided we would do something. So we've organised a lot of self-guided rides, some kind of online presentations, and a series of Q&As with people like yourself. A person who's got Leicestershire roots, but is a global cyclist and has a fascinating take on the world. Just to set the scene, so we will. I'll ask you some questions for about 30 minutes, but to set the scene for people who are assuming have not read any of your books, perhaps not been to any of your presentations, but might be interested to come back to some future book presentations in more detail. Could you just share with us and anyone's watching, or anyone who is watching, your experience of life in Leicestershire, how you got into cycling, and how that kind of evolved into the kind of trans-global expeditions that you've undertaken since?
Yeah, certainly, and thanks for inviting me along. It's always really nice to be part of what you guys are doing there in Leicester and at Ride Leicester. For me, where it all started out, I was born in London, and then when parents separated, my mum's from the Midlands, so I moved up with her to a town just outside the city of Leicester. And really the bicycle, I remember having my first bike that was bought new for me at about the age of 6, and it was just that sort of feeling of liberation that came with it that I think a lot of us can relate to. And then by the time I was age 10, I kind of asked my mum one afternoon if I could ride to my grandparents' house, which was about 10 miles away. And it was that sort of, that sense that it was quite far, that it was further than anywhere I considered. But I set out to do it, and I made it there, and within an hour kind of thing. And then later that afternoon, I made it back another 10 miles, and it was that sort of first independence that from there only grew, really. And I really fell in love with the idea of professional cycling, with the Tour de France. And I got my Lycra and my road bike, and so I was out into the lanes of Leicestershire trying to go further and further into Warwickshire. Age 19, I rode to Portugal. I'm half Turkish, and then a year later I rode to Istanbul. A year later I rode back to Istanbul. And then when I was 23, I broke a world record for cycling around the world. So, really it's always been there. And again, that sort of sense of, the town I grew up in not being a place that had an awful lot going on, and quite a lot of, disadvantage and things that a young lad is best steering clear of. So really the bicycle was a bit of a way out for me. And it's always really nice to take part in the community that has grown up, particularly I think in the last 10 years around cycling, where you see places like Leicester remodelling their cities around the bicycle, where you see youngsters increasingly getting into cycling, and it's really always a pleasure to be part of it.
The two people that we've interviewed, one earlier today and one later last week, Susan Dorham and Mike Sheldrake, they're both, Mike describes himself as an adventurer, Susan describes herself as a traveller. They set off around the world in different ways. I've asked them both whether they're writing about what they experienced, because they've obviously had a fascinating change-making experience. Susan is thinking about it, just starting to do that at the moment. Mike was very much in two minds about the idea he did. So there are things that I can't share that I have experienced, because people need to find them for themselves, which I thought was a nice poetic line on things. You've taken a very definite path of writing about your experiences. Life Cycles, your first book, was a bestseller and told a very a very specific and detailed story about what that challenge meant for you. What do you get out of writing about it? What have you what led you to writing and gave you the voice or the confidence to write about your experience on that and other trips?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, writing was always such an integral part of it, of travel, and generally my trips, overwhelmingly, I've been on my own. Certainly when I cycled around the world, I was on my own. And so, writing represents a great companion. And then, having said that, in daily life, for the most part, when I'm in London or when I'm in Istanbul or wherever it might be, I've got a background in political science in terms of study, and with the current moment being no exception, the world can often seem like a slightly crazy place. So, writing is a way, in some ways, of sort of slowing the speed down of it all and making sense of it and kind of crafting your own thoughts on your own terms, in amongst, as I say, the sort of, the chaos that swirls without. And I think in many ways it actually has a similarity to cycling in itself. They're both these acts that kind of insist on taking life at your own speed and a speed that's a little bit more human. I mean, if you take the transport of an aeroplane or a car, which either sort of hurtles you across the world and into from one identical airport terminal to another at 700 miles an hour, or a car that puts you inside a metal box that is entirely kind of alien to the human surroundings. I think there's almost a parallel there to what that represents to the bicycle, being in similar ways the act of writing, and I write in a notepad with a pen. And in a world of social media where you see small videos from across the world of horrific things, of funny things, of unbelievable things at kind of light speed, I think, as I say, the act of writing can really help take all of that and put it under control, and it keeps it a bit more human and a bit more timeless.
And would you, in the process of written the book, say Life Cycles, were you writing that book in your head on your notepad after a day's cycling as you were travelling around, or was that something you formulated once you'd arrived back in London?
No, it was going as I was travelling. In some ways it was going before I was travelling. Cycling through the deserts of central China or what have you, and you've got 3-4 hours in the middle of the day, or in Kazakhstan or in Uyghur, in the northwest of China, you've got 3-4 hours where you can't go anywhere for heat. So I'd be sitting at my roadside cafes, taking my notes, and it's a fantastic way to record a new place, a new culture. It's much less invasive than taking video, taking photos. You can do it kind of discreetly and privately and just for yourself kind of thing. Even prior to going around the world, I've been a bicycle messenger in the city of London. And originally my idea for Life Cycles would be that it would be a book that had the city of London, the world, and then return to the city of London. And as a career in London, you kind of see a lot of the world through its offices, I would have been delivering messages to the Kazakh or the Eurasian Natural Minerals and Resources Commission, which has its office in St James's, and then you'd have me on my bicycle in the middle of the Kazakh steppe. You might find security personnel or clerical staff from all around the world in the loading bays of London. So I really wanted to write the two together. But then, of course, where it does have to change is to the reality of the publishing industry. And certainly, as a debut author at the time, no one was going to commission a sort of 3-part treatise on the city of London, the world, and then the return to the city. So, there's always a question of adapting to what readers want, what the market wants, what publishers think market and the readers want. And Palestine and my latest book, 50 Miles Wide, is now my 5th. So at this point, I'm kind of a little bit more desensitized to, figuring out what works and working with publishers. But, as with anything, it's a real learning curve.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about 50 Miles Wide in a moment. Messengers was your second book. So was that really the remnants which didn't make it into the first book became the second story once success had been established? Is that how it worked?
Yeah, no, I mean that was exactly it, really. And in ways, it was quite liberating, like letting go of my idea of an Odyssey of a three-part debut and realizing actually this stood alone as a nice separate book. But yeah, I mean, Messengers, it's a book that's very dear to me as well because, as I say, you do see the world in the city of London.
Yeah.
And in my mind, you see the world nowhere better than from the saddle of a bicycle, whether that's in the deep south of the United States and meeting impoverished pecan nut farmers, or whether it's riding through wind turbines in Uyghur in northwest China. It is, or whether you're going in and out of loading bays. I was, as the financial crisis struck in 2008, I was delivering administration notices to Lehman Brothers and, getting paid £2.50 per delivery for those notices, while Lehman went under at $33 billion of debt. So, it's being that very small cog in this large kind of neoliberal system, but always with the camaraderie of the bicycle and the other members of the cycle career community, and in this system and this city and metropolis of London, feeling, again, sort of differently, but the same to the lanes of Leicester, that the bicycle is like your autonomy, your inroad into the city being your own and living it somewhat on your own terms. So really that's, as well as the process, which was tough, of adjusting from cycling around the world to coming back to London, that's really what the story of Messengers tells.
Your third book, and I know we're skipping through these, and there's a lot of detail, and we'll pick some of them up again in future conversations. But your third book has been described as on the road for the Occupy generation. You're hitchhiking around North America and basically exposing what has possibly become more evident to us in the kind of seeing the Black Lives Matters movement, seeing the impact of the presidency, the Trump presidency, and the kind of the wails of pain and anger that are evident in some parts of North America. But I was really struck by a couple of things in it. One was your interaction with lorry drivers who you met, who were from northern India, and the other was your interaction with people who were described otherwise and pejoratively as white trash, people living in trailer parks, and your deep feeling that they were unjustly treated and they were unjustly slated in a lot of ways for their poverty. Both equally kind of suffering how did you? What's your take on it now after 4 or 5 years since that experience?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways unchanged. It was 2014 that I hitchhiked across the United States. I mean, I've cycled across the United States and I've hitchhiked across the United States. Cycled in 2009, hitchhiked in 2014. And just the nature of those experiences was in themselves very different. And I don't think it was just that it was 2009 and you had the optimism of an incoming Obama administration. I think actually something about the bicycle really captures the spirit of the people that you meet. You're picking yourself up by your bootstraps, you're moving, you're doing something that really kind of resonates with that US get up and do it spirit. And then hitchhiking, you're kind of much more reliant on others helping, and sort of disappointingly, depressingly, that really brought out an awful lot of negativity. People think that you're homeless, people think that you're poor, people think that you're begging. People, really mistrust you, which is a kind of very kind of hard reality and level of judgment to spend all day up against. So, there were very different experiences, and that in both of them, however, what you certainly see is the kind of impoverishment of the United States, which really did make Trump an awful lot less surprising. actually, at the same time, it's important that my trips in the US were under Obama administrations. I mean, this idea of Trump of an aberration from the US way is really as far from the truth as it could be, to my mind. He's actually the inevitable culmination of what you see on the ground in the United States, which is decrepit infrastructure, which is lack of community, pulled apart by roads, pulled apart by bad food, pulled apart by public health crisis, obesity, and opiate addiction. So yeah, I kind of really felt I'd been braced for it somewhat by this kind of on the ground sort of travel, if we're going to call it that. In terms of how things change with protest movements, I mean, I do think it's obviously important to differentiate, because the Black Lives Matter movement has really done an excellent job of making very clear that when you live your life inside black or brown skin, and certainly with the nature of US law enforcement, not to mention employment prospects, there's an entire level of prejudice and microaggression, not to mention actual aggression, that people live with day in, day out. And that's my own, I'm half Turkish, I identify somewhat as Muslim, but I was very conscious as the police pulled me off the road saying that hitchhiking was illegal, that my white skin was a kind of armour in those situations. So I definitely would never at any point do an all lives matter kind of take on the Black Lives Matter movement. But at the same time, seeing the poverty firsthand of white trailer families in Louisiana, prostitution and methamphetamine addiction in the trailer parks and the truck stops outside of Indiana and Indianapolis. Essentially, I think what you have to understand about the United States, and particularly sort of poor white US communities, is that in the Jim Crow era, pre-civil rights, in the segregation era, these white communities who are poor, who live very kind of disadvantaged lives with low levels of education and public health, they were told essentially that one thing that they had going for them was the idea that they were better than the blacks. And then the civil rights movement came about and managed to deliver some degree of equality, which has really been sort of slightly superficial level of equality in some ways anyway. And suddenly you've got those white communities living alongside black communities and told that they're equal. So I think there's kind of historic grievance there, because essentially in the US, side by side, you have people of different racial groups living together, in conditions that are unseen or unheard of within Europe. I mean, I've travelled a lot in Europe as well, and I don't think I've ever seen the sort of low levels of development that you do in the United States. And when people are left to share that level of underdevelopment, I think it is a sort of breeding ground for resentment, and especially then when you match it to a low level of education that's also prevalent in the United States, unfortunately.
Your fourth book, Julian, All at Sea, is the one that I'm least familiar with, apart from the one that's just come out, which I've not read. How would you describe All at Sea? What's the tenet of that book, and does that return to cycling?
Yeah, well, let's see. It was a little project, really. I mean, it's a shorter book. I was basically recruited to go out to a small island in the Andaman Sea, in the tropical island off the coast of Thailand, and to live and work with these Moken sea gypsies, who are nomadic people who move between islands and go from island to island, live on their boats, and really are very, very much at one with the water and the sea in that way. And I think it's kind of my same sort of approach to the way that you see the world when you travel. It was really looking to go to a place that was kind of outside of all of the normal systems of geography, capital, of language, and water as well was a kind of unfamiliar place for me in lots of ways. That was, being on boats. Most of my journeys have been, hitchhiked or by bicycle. So it was really kind of interesting in terms of looking at things like maritime boundaries, ocean pollution. And climate change is always a theme in my work. And then actually just the nature of borders to people who've always lived nomadically. So it was that constant theme of travel and how we kind of relate to our world.
I think that's a common story that both Susan, who we've talked to, and Mike Sheldrick were highlighting. It's their connectivity with the landscape and with the people is the kind of insight that you gain from the traveling by bike. So in your we want to invite you back to a longer conversation, an illustration of the 50 miles wide of your latest book. How would you describe it for somebody who's not read any of your books and might be interested to read it before hearing you talk about it in more detail? What would you summarise that trip to be about, and what did you find?
It's hard to summarise it quickly. I guess it's taken what has become my formula, which is looking at the world from the saddle.
Yeah.
And as someone who is partly of the Middle East, I mean, as with anyone, movements everywhere, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement has done a very good job of making clear that the rights of Palestinians is all. We're not free until we're all free. Is kind of a statement that has kind of come about a lot in activism since the Arab Spring in the Middle East, and Palestine is very much a part of that. And so it was really wanting to go with a bicycle and looking at this land that has become so kind of fraught with the traumas associated with it, which to my mind, I'm quite an optimistic person. I don't know if that's down to the bicycle and the way I've travelled or the amount I've travelled and the good experiences I've had. But I feel that level of trauma and pain that is now being imbued into Palestine and that the Palestinian people are expected to suffer is really difficult. And the bicycle was a really healthy insight into that. It might be that on a bicycle you see the reality of a 9-metre concrete wall that divides parts of the West Bank from other parts of Palestine and other parts of Israel, and the brutality of something like a concrete wall, or a road that only Israelis can drive on, or a settler checkpoint where a Palestinian cyclist is going to be harassed, or guys from the Palestinian cycling community who ride off-road because the roads are covered in checkpoints, and then they get harassed by settlers on the mountain bike trails. So, I think the bicycle is a way of seeing geography up close, which was really a very valuable insight. But then also it's a way of having a commonality with people, and certainly I kind of think that maybe there's this optimism to the bicycle, and a lot of the people I spoke with in Israel who were part of the cycling community, I think, had a greater sense of the injustice that was being done in their name in Palestine against Palestinians. And equally in Palestine, I met members of the Palestinian cycling community who really just want to ride their bikes, who want to ride their bikes in the way that I did as a young lad growing up in the Midlands, without having to worry about military checkpoints or racism. And it's that kind of, that sense of kin and commonality and unity and just rights. I think that the bicycle helps in some ways to kind of cut through a lot of what is often presented as being problematic. And it gets you down to some truth kind of thing. So, yeah, if that's a small enough nutshell, I guess that's how I'd describe it.
Well, that sounds like a pretty fruitful nutshell from which people can, I'm sure, get nourished. Where do you direct people to buy your latest book, and indeed your previous books?
Yeah, I mean, they're all available from all good bookshops. It's always good to give the business to a local independent. If not, then Waterstones, Foiled, and then big bad corporates like Amazon are also stocking it. So anywhere really, and to anyone that does get a hold of it, I hope that they enjoy it.
And they can also find it on your links on your website. your web page?
Yeah, I mean, earlier in the pandemic, they certainly can. Links on my website, juliansayarer.com. Earlier in the pandemic, logistics were a little bit up in the air, so I was posting a few out myself. I still got a few left if anyone wants them. But yeah.
Look, that's fantastic. I think we'll draw it to a close there. Hopefully, this has been a really good introduction to your work and the kind of the general thesis of your work and your experience, which is fantastic. It's always great to talk to riders from Leicester and Leicestershire about their experiences of the globe, because invariably people bring back insight, friends. And stories and ideas that are universal, which is really fantastic. And I think you've been really inspirational to a number of the riders who've undertaken those kind of longer trips in within the city, because you talk to most of them and they say, well, we came to Julian's presentation, or we came to a presentation about a book that he was talking about, in a story. And I thought, well, I can do that. I can try that. It's something that you can pick up. We would really like to invite you back to speak in more depth in a structured conversation about 50 miles wide in maybe a month or so's time. Would you be happy to do that?
Yeah, no, it's always a pleasure. And speaking to your last point as well about inspiring people. I mean, every so often you get an email from someone who maybe quit their job or did their tour because they've been putting off for years, and the book life cycles on my talk help them get around to it. And that's always great. But I'm always just as happy when someone thinks, well, if this guy cycled to Shanghai, then maybe I can ditch the car and start cycling to work. I mean, it's all about starting somewhere and realising you can go far, kind of thing.
Brilliant. Julian, thanks very much, and thanks for supporting the Ride Leicester Festival 2020.
It's a pleasure.